I thought St. Margaret's Home for Girls would offer me peace and protection. Instead, it was where I lost everything I held sacred at the hands of the very man who was meant to guide me toward God. My name is Brenda, and I am 84 years old. For 66 of those years, I have carried a secret that has festered in my soul, a story I buried so deep I almost convinced myself it had happened to someone else. Today, sitting in my quiet little kitchen, my heart finally resolute, I've decided to tell you the truth of what happened to me when I was just a girl of 18. It's a truth I hid from my loving husband, God rest his soul, and from my own children. But now, as my days grow shorter, I feel the overwhelming need to release this burden. Perhaps, just perhaps, my story might reach another soul who has walked through a similar fire and is struggling to find their way out of the darkness. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? It all began in the late 50s, after the death of my mother, Shirley. That winter, tuberculosis had stolen her from us, leaving a void in our small home that felt colder and emptier than any winter storm. It left just me and my father, Larry, adrift in a sea of grief and a poverty so profound it felt like a physical weight. I was 18 then, thin from not having enough to eat, but I still had a fire in me, a fierce determination I'd inherited from my mother. "Dad," I said one evening. We were sitting at our scratched wooden table, the only light coming from a single flickering candle that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The silence in the house was a constant reminder of who was missing. "I've made a decision. I'm going to go to St. Margaret's Home for Girls. I'll be taken care of there, and it'll be one less mouth for you to feed." My father looked up at me, his face etched with a weariness that went far beyond his years. I could see the conflict in his expression, the shame of a man who couldn't provide for his only child warring with the stark reality of our situation. He knew I was right. It was the only sensible solution. Our small farm was failing, the debts were piling up, and he was working himself to the bone for barely enough to keep a roof over our heads. But for me, in the innocence of my 18 years, the idea of St. Margaret's sparked a flicker of hope. A home for girls, run by the church. I had heard it was a place of discipline and piety, a sanctuary. My mother had filled my head with stories of devout women who dedicated their lives to charity and prayer. I pictured myself in a simple, clean dress, kneeling in a sunlit chapel, surrounded by kind, wise women who would teach me scripture and guide my path. I imagined a life of purpose, of service, a life free from the constant, gnawing worry about where our next meal would come from. I saw it not as an abandonment of my father, but as a noble sacrifice that would ease his burden. I was a naive country girl, and I had no idea I was about to willingly walk into a gilded cage, an inferno disguised as heaven. The journey to St. Margaret's took an entire day. My father borrowed a neighbor's old, rattling truck to drive me there. We traveled through rolling hills and valleys I'd never seen before, the landscape changing from the familiar fields of home to a wilder, more imposing countryside. I clutched a small, worn suitcase that held my few belongings: 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of the Bible my mother had given me, and her only piece of jewelry, a simple wooden cross on a leather cord. My father barely spoke a word the entire trip. He just kept his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Every so often I'd see him quickly wipe at his eyes with the back of his hand, but whenever he caught me looking, he'd turn his head away, ashamed to show his sorrow. The unspoken grief hung between us, thicker than the dust kicked up by the truck's tires. We were both pretending this was a good thing, a step toward a better future, but the truth was, it felt like we were being torn apart. St. Margaret's Home for Girls stood on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by a high, imposing stone wall. It looked more like a fortress than a house of prayer. A chill traced its way down my spine as we passed through the heavy, wrought iron gates. The air inside the walls felt different, still and cold, carrying the scent of beeswax, disinfectant, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A faint, musty odor of secrets and sorrows long kept hidden. The woman who greeted us was the matron of the home. She was a tall, stern figure, and her welcome was delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome, young lady. You'll find that a life of discipline, obedience, and prayer is the key to a woman's salvation." My father hugged me, a fierce, desperate embrace that lasted a moment too long. I could feel the tremors running through his body. He pressed his lips to my forehead and whispered, "Be a good girl, Brenda. Make your mother proud." Then he turned and walked away without looking back, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched the old truck rattle back down the long driveway until it was just a speck in the distance, feeling a profound sense of abandonment settle over me. I was utterly alone. I stood there in the vast, echoing hallway, clutching my suitcase, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure the whole building could hear it. The matron's voice cut through my daze, sharp and clear. "Sister Linda will show you to your room and explain the rules." A younger woman, a nun, approached. She moved with a strange, silent grace across the polished stone floors. There was a placid look on her face, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. A flicker of something I couldn't name, like a person who knew a joke that no one else was in on. It was a look of knowingness that seemed out of place in such a devout setting. My room, they called it a cell, was a tiny, stark space. It contained a narrow iron bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden crucifix on the wall, and a single high window barred with iron, overlooking a bleak inner courtyard. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless gray. "This will be your home now," Sister Linda said, her voice a smooth, almost syrupy melody. "But you must remember, Brenda, we have very strict rules at St. Margaret's. Those who do not follow them are punished, severely. And there are people here whom it is wise never, ever to displease." Her emphasis on the word people was subtle, but it sent another shiver of apprehension through me. I didn't understand her warning then, but the way she said it, the strange gleam in her eyes, made the blood in my veins run cold. The first few weeks were a blur of rigid routine. We rose before dawn for morning prayers, our voices a monotonous drone in the frigid chapel. This was followed by meager breakfasts of watery oatmeal, eaten in complete silence in a cavernous dining hall. Then came lessons with a kindly but timid nun named Sister Carol, who taught us basic literacy and scripture. The afternoons were filled with hard, physical labor, scrubbing floors, laundry in steaming tubs, weeding the vast vegetable gardens. More prayers followed, then a silent supper, and finally, evening vespers. By the time I was allowed to return to my cell, I would collapse onto the hard mattress, clutching my mother's wooden cross, and cry silently in the dark, my body aching and my soul starved for a single word of genuine kindness. It was during my third week that I met him. Reverend Gary was the spiritual director of the home, a man who held immense power within those stone walls. He was not an old man, perhaps in his late 30s, and he carried himself with an air of absolute authority. His voice was deep and resonant, a powerful instrument that filled the chapel during his Sunday sermons, holding every girl and nun captive. His sermons were mesmerizing, full of fire and brimstone, but also of promises of divine love for those who were truly obedient. All the nuns deferred to him, some with reverence, others with what I now recognize as fear. When he walked down the corridors, a hush would fall, and everyone would press themselves against the walls to let him pass, averting their eyes as if looking at him directly was a sin. The first time he spoke to me, I was alone in the chapel after Vespers. tasked with polishing the silver candlesticks. The other girls had already been dismissed to their rooms. I was so engrossed in my work, trying to rub away the tarnish, that I didn't hear him approach. "You're the new arrival." His voice, so close behind me, was not the booming sermon voice I was used to. It was low and intimate, and it startled me so much that I nearly dropped the heavy candlestick. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. "Yes, Reverend Gary," I stammered, automatically curtsying as we'd been taught. He moved closer, stepping out of the shadows and into the soft candlelight. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with something sharper. A scent I would come to know and dread, the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Brenda, isn't it?" he said, his gaze intense. "A young woman who wishes to serve the Lord." "Yes, Reverend." He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a heavy hand, and it felt proprietary, not pastoral. My whole body tensed at the contact. His fingers began to move, a slow, deliberate kneading motion that made my skin crawl. "You are very innocent," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There is so much you have yet to learn about the true mysteries of faith. Perhaps I could offer you some private instruction to help you grow more quickly in the Lord's grace." There was an undertone in his voice, a strange caress in the way he said certain words that set off alarm bells deep within me. A part of my mind, the naive girl who wanted to believe in the goodness of this place, told me I was being honored. A man of God had seen something special in me. But another part, a primal female instinct I didn't know I possessed, was screaming at me that this was wrong. This was dangerous. But who was I to question him? I was a poor, uneducated girl from the country. He was a revered man of the cloth, a spiritual leader. To doubt his intentions felt like a sin in itself. "That would be an honor, Reverend Gary," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, even as my intuition screamed at me to run. "Excellent," he said. The pressure of his hand on my shoulder increased, almost painfully. "We will begin tomorrow evening, after Vespers, in my private study. And you must remember, my child." His grip tightened, a clear message of control. "What passes between a pastor and a member of his flock is sacred, a holy confidence between you, me, and God himself. You are never, ever to speak of our lessons to anyone else. To do so would be a grievous sin. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I didn't understand at all, not really. But his words burned themselves into my mind like a brand. Sacred, secret, grievous sin. Never speak of it. That night, sleep offered no escape. I tossed and turned on my narrow bed, staring at the crucifix on the wall. In the shifting moonlight that streamed through the barred window, it seemed as if the figure on the cross was watching me, its expression one of sorrowful accusation. I was 18 years old, but I knew nothing of the world, nothing of men, and certainly nothing of the darkness that could hide behind a clerical collar. I clutched my mother's cross and prayed, telling myself that a man of God had chosen me for special teachings, that maybe this was the first step on my path to becoming the devout woman my mother always wanted me to be. The following day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. I couldn't focus on my chores, my lessons, or even my prayers. My mind kept replaying his words, the feel of that heavy hand on my shoulder, the intensity in his gaze. During the silent supper, I caught Sister Linda watching me from across the room. She gave me a small, knowing smile, the same strange smile from my first day, and it made my stomach churn with a nameless dread. Did she know? Was she part of this? After Vespers, as the other girls filed out of the chapel towards the dormitory wing, I stood frozen for a moment, my feet feeling as if they were rooted to the stone floor. Every instinct told me to go with them, to run to my cell and lock the door. But the Reverend's warning about a grievous sin echoed in my ears. I was trapped by my own piety, my own fear of divine retribution. With a deep, shuddering breath, I turned and walked down the forbidden corridor that led to the clergy's private quarters. The air here was even colder, the silence more profound. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. When I reached the heavy oak door of his study, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the wood. Before I could knock, the door swung silently inward. Reverend Gary stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight from within. He was smiling, but it was a smile I had never seen on him in the chapel. It held no warmth, no holiness. It was the predatory smile of a wolf. "Punctual," he said, his voice smoother than I had ever heard it. "Excellent. Obedience is the first and greatest virtue. Come in, my child." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "It's time for your spiritual education to begin." I stepped across the threshold into that room, which smelled of old leather, books, and whiskey, not knowing that the girl who entered would never truly leave. I was stepping into the end of my childhood, the beginning of a nightmare that would shadow the rest of my life. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound echoed in the sudden, heavy silence of the room, sealing my fate. Reverend Gary's study was nothing like the rest of St. Margaret's. Where the halls were cold and sparse, this room was suffocatingly full. Dark, heavy bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with imposing leather-bound volumes that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. A massive desk, carved from some dark, unidentifiable wood, dominated the space, its surface orderly and bare except for a single crystal glass and a half-empty bottle of amber liquid. The air was thick with the smells I'd noticed before. Old paper, leather, and that sharp, sweet scent of whiskey, all mingling to create an atmosphere of oppressive, masculine authority. It was his sanctuary, his throne room, and I was the unwelcome supplicant. "Sit," he commanded, his voice losing its feigned gentleness and taking on the hard edge of command I'd heard him use with the groundskeeper. He pointed to a single stiff-backed chair positioned directly in front of his desk, a clear seat of interrogation. I moved mechanically, my legs feeling unsteady, and perched on the very edge of the chair. He walked around the desk, the sound of his footsteps unnervingly loud on the wooden floor, and lowered himself into his own large, throne-like leather chair. The desk between us felt like a chasm, but it offered no protection. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. He poured a small amount of whiskey into his glass, swirled it, and took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, designed to unnerve me, and it was working. "Tell me, Brenda," he began at last, setting the glass down with a soft click. "What do you believe is the purpose of suffering?" The question caught me completely off guard. I had expected a lecture, a scripture reading, not a philosophical interrogation. I suppose it's a test, Reverend," I stammered, recalling fragments from his own sermons. "A test from God, to strengthen our faith." "A test," he repeated, nodding slowly as if I'd said something profound. "Precisely. And the greatest saints, the ones closest to the divine heart of the Father, are the ones who endure the greatest tests. Their suffering purifies them, burns away the dross of worldly attachment, until only the pure, shining soul remains. Do you understand this concept?" "I think so, sir." "Good," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping again into that conspiratorial whisper. "Because I have seen something in you, Brenda, from the moment you arrived. A purity, a raw, untempered spirit. The Lord has spoken to me in my prayers. He has told me that you have the potential for a truly profound connection with Him, But your soul is like an uncut diamond. It needs pressure. It needs shaping. He rose from his chair and began to pace slowly behind me. I sat ramrod straight, every muscle in my body screaming, my eyes fixed on a knot in the wood of his desk. I could feel his presence behind me, a palpable heat, and I held my breath, listening to the soft tread of his shoes on the floor. "Obedience is the key," he continued, his voice now a low murmur right beside my ear, making me flinch. "Absolute, unquestioning obedience. When I speak to you, it is not I who is speaking, but God who is speaking through me. I am his vessel, his instrument on this earth, chosen to guide his flock. To disobey me is to disobey God himself. Do you believe that, Brenda?" My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Everything he was saying was a distorted echo of the teachings I'd received my entire life. Respect your elders, obey the clergy. They were God's representatives. To argue felt like blasphemy. "Yes, Reverend," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. His hands landed on my shoulders again, heavier this time, more insistent. His fingers dug into the thin fabric of my dress, pressing into the bone. "Then you understand that for your education to begin, you must submit. You must trust my guidance, even if you do not understand it. The ways of the Lord are often mysterious to a young, untutored mind like your own." His hands began to move, sliding down from my shoulders to my upper arms. A wave of revulsion, cold and sickening, washed over me. This was wrong. My heart, my soul, my entire being knew this was horribly, terribly wrong. An ancient primal instinct was sounding a deafening alarm. "Reverend, please," I choked out, my voice barely a tremor. I think I should go back to my room." "Oh no, my child," he said, his voice turning harsh, the pretense of spiritual guidance vanishing in an instant. "The lesson has only just begun. And if you attempt to leave this room, if you dare to speak a word of what happens here to anyone, do you know what will happen?" I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes, blurring the image of the great, dark desk before me. "You will be cast into the outer darkness," he hissed, his breath hot against my neck. "Because what is about to happen is God's will for you. It is your test. And to refuse a test from God is the greatest sin of all. Your father left you here. He placed you in my care because he knew I could save your soul. But if you do not obey..." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but unmistakable. With a strength that terrified me, he spun my chair around to face him. His expression was no longer calm or authoritative. It was something else entirely, something dark and ravenous that I had never seen on a human face before. It was the face of a predator. What happened next is a memory that has played itself in the dark theater of my mind for 66 years. It's a memory I have tried to burn, to drown, to bury, but it remains. Not in the details of the physical act, my mind, in a mercy I am forever grateful for, has shrouded that in fog, but in the sheer, soul-crushing weight of the betrayal. He was a man of God. This was a house of God. I was a child of God. And all of it was a lie. I remember praying. As he began to touch me in ways that felt like a violation of my very soul, I prayed. I prayed to God the Father. I prayed to the memory of my mother. I prayed to every angel and saint whose name I knew. I begged for a sign, for a lightning strike, for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But the heavens were silent. The room remained still. God was not there. At some point, in my terror, I must have cried out, a desperate, hopeless sound. I heard a noise at the door, a soft click. For a wild, soaring moment, I thought it was my salvation. Someone had heard me. Someone was coming to help. The door opened, and Sister Linda stood there. The relief that flooded me was so intense it almost made me faint. "Sister Linda," I cried, my voice raw with a desperate plea. Help me. But she didn't move. She simply stood in the doorway, her hands folded calmly in front of her, and watched. There was no shock on her face, no horror, no pity. There was only that same placid, knowing expression I had seen before, now amplified into something monstrous. She was not a savior. She was a spectator. The Reverend turned his head slightly, his expression one of mild irritation. "Linda," he said, his voice flat, "come in and close the door." She obeyed instantly, stepping into the room and shutting the door with a soft, final click that sealed the room and my fate. She leaned back against the wood, a silent, willing witness to my defilement. The last ember of hope inside me died, leaving behind only cold, black ash. I was trapped with the monster and his accomplice. I don't know how long it went on. Time ceased to have meaning. My mind detached itself from my body, floating up to a corner of the ceiling from where I watched the horrific scene unfold as if it were happening to a stranger, a girl in a storybook who had made a terrible mistake. I felt the pain, but it was distant, dulled by the shock and the horror of the betrayal. The truest pain was not in my body, but in my spirit, which was being torn to shreds. My innocence, my faith, my belief in the fundamental goodness of the world, all of it was being systematically destroyed in that suffocating, whiskey-scented room, while one servant of God brutalized me and another watched. When it was finally over, I was a heap on the floor, curled into a tight ball, trembling uncontrollably. He simply straightened his clothing, walked back to his desk, and poured himself another glass of whiskey as if nothing more than a tiresome chore had been completed. "Remember," he said, his voice returning to its authoritative tone as I struggled to pull myself into a sitting position, my limbs refusing to cooperate. "This is our secret, ours and God's. If you speak, I will be forced to tell the matron and your own father that you are a temptress, a liar, filled with wicked fantasies. Who do you think they will believe, Brenda? A troubled, hysterical girl, or a man of my standing?" Sister Linda glided over to me. She knelt down and began to straighten my disheveled dress with an air of detached efficiency, as if tidying up after a spill. "He's right," she whispered, her voice a poisonous parody of comfort. "No one would ever believe you. And if you try to run from this place, we will find you. We always find the ones who run." Somehow I got to my feet. I stumbled out of that room, my body a vessel of shame and pain, my mind a hollow, echoing chamber. The long, dark corridor back to my cell seemed to stretch for an eternity, the stone walls closing in on me. When I finally reached the sanctuary of my tiny room, I collapsed onto the bed and wept. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut, until there were no tears left inside me, only a vast, arid emptiness. I clutched my mother's wooden cross so tightly that its edges cut into my palm, but it offered no comfort. It was just a piece of wood. That night marked the beginning of my true damnation. The routine was established. Every 2 or 3 nights after Vespers, I would be summoned. I would walk the death row corridor to his study, and the horror would repeat itself, sometimes with variations of cruelty I could never have imagined. And always, Sister Linda was there. She was no longer just a spectator. She became an active participant in my torment, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one that was perhaps even more damaging. She would hold my hand, stroke my hair, and whisper to me while the Reverend used my body. "You are so special, Brenda," she would murmur, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "So chosen. This pain is a holy gift. It is making you pure. You are serving God in a way the other girls could never understand." Her words were a masterclass in cruelty, a deliberate, twisted corruption of everything I had ever held sacred. She was trying to reshape my reality, to convince me that this nightmare was, in fact, an honor. And the most terrifying part was that I think she truly believed it. In her warped mind, this was a form of love, a sacred trinity of abuser, victim, and witness. One afternoon, a few weeks into this new, horrific reality, we were working in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of cabbages under the hot sun. Sister Linda came to inspect my work, kneeling beside me. "Are you adjusting to your special duties?" she asked, her voice low and sweet, her hands methodically plucking a stubborn weed. The casualness of her question, the sheer audacity of it, made bile rise in my throat. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, Sister Linda, I don't want to go to his room again, please." She stopped her work and turned to look at me. Her placid smile was fixed in place, but her eyes were as hard and cold as river stones. "Oh, my dear, foolish child, you still don't understand, do you? This is your purpose now. The Reverend saw the potential for true holiness in you, and I have the privilege of witnessing your sanctification." "But it hurts," I sobbed, the tears I was always fighting to hold back finally spilling over, tracing paths through the dirt on my cheeks. "It feels filthy." "Pain is purification," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "And filth is in your mind. You should feel honored, blessed. Now stop this foolish crying and remember this." She leaned closer, her face just inches from mine. "If you ever show such weakness again, if you try to refuse, or if I even suspect you have spoken a word of this to anyone, even to Sister Carol, I will be the first to testify that you are a wicked, lying girl who tried to seduce a man of God. I will make sure you are punished so severely you will wish you were dead. Am I clear?" I could only nod, silenced by the venom in her words. That day, I understood that I was not trapped by one monster, but by two. One was the predator, and the other was the keeper of his cage. That night, unable to sleep, I crept out of my room, needing to walk, to feel anything other than the suffocating stillness of my cell. As I passed the small room where Sister Carol prepared her lessons, I heard hushed voices from within. I pressed my ear to the cold wood of the door. "It's not right," a young nun was saying. "She's just a girl, Carol." "He can't keep doing this to her." "And what would you have me do?" Sister Carol's voice was weary, defeated. "Do you think I haven't tried? Do you think the matron doesn't know? She knows everything." My blood ran cold. She knows. Then why does she allow it? There was a bitter sigh. "Because Reverend Gary's family are major benefactors to this home. They are wealthy and influential. And because Brenda is not the first. There was another girl a few years ago, and another before her. It is always the newest ones, the ones without family to ask questions." A terrible certainty began to dawn on me, a horror that eclipsed everything else. I was not special. I was just the next in a line. "What happened to the last one?" the young nun asked, her voice a frightened whisper. "She ran away one night," Sister Carol said, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear it. "They found her in the river the next day. They said it was an accident. They said she must have slipped and fallen in the dark." A long pause. "She didn't slip." I backed away from the door, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a scream. I stumbled back to my room, the overheard conversation replaying in my mind. She didn't slip. The words were a death sentence. Escape was not an option. It was a choice between a slow death in the Reverend's study or a quick one in the cold, dark river. For the first time since arriving at St. Margaret's, I felt the true, bottomless depth of my despair. There was no way out. The knowledge I'd gleaned from behind Sister Carol's door was a poison that seeped into everything. It tainted the watery oatmeal at breakfast, the pale sunlight in the garden, the hollow chants of our evening prayers. Before, I had existed in a state of isolated horror, believing my suffering was unique. Now, I understood I was merely the latest chapter in a secret, gruesome history written within the walls of St. Margaret's. I was not special, not chosen for a test, but simply the next available body for a predator's appetite. I began to see ghosts. I saw them in the empty chairs in the dining hall, in the flickering shadows of the chapel. I gave them names, whispered in the dark of my cell. The girl from the river, the girl who went mad. Were they like me? Had they also believed the Reverend's twisted words at first? Had they cried out for a God who never answered? The despair I felt was no longer a sharp, piercing cry, but a dull, constant, crushing weight. It was the weight of knowing that escape was a fantasy, that my only two paths led to either madness or the cold, silent riverbed. My nights in the Reverend's study continued with their grim regularity, but something inside me had changed. The shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, simmering rage that I kept carefully hidden. I learned to separate my mind from my body, a trick of survival that became my only shield. While he used me, I would travel elsewhere in my thoughts. I would meticulously rebuild my childhood home, room by room, remembering the pattern on my mother's favorite tablecloth, the scent of her baking bread. I would walk through the fields with my father, feeling a phantom sun on my skin. I did this to keep a part of myself pure, a small, secret garden within my soul where he could not reach. I began to play a role. I became the docile, obedient creature he and Sister Linda wanted me to be. I stopped fighting, stopped pleading. I would meet his gaze with a carefully constructed emptiness, giving him nothing of the real Brenda to feast upon. This seemed to satisfy him, and Sister Linda praised my progress. "You see," she would say to me during our sessions, stroking my hair as I stared blankly at the wall, "you are finally accepting the Lord's will. You are becoming a vessel of true grace." I let her believe it. I let them both believe they were breaking me, all the while a tiny, hard kernel of defiance was growing in the secret garden of my mind. I decided I would not end up like the girl in the river, a victim of circumstance. If I was to die, I would die fighting. I would die on my own terms, running towards freedom, not sinking into despair. The change came on a damp, cold evening in late autumn. The wind howled around the stone walls of St. Margaret's, a mournful, lonely sound. Reverend Gary was more drunk than I had ever seen him. The reek of whiskey was so strong it made my eyes water, and his movements were clumsy, his words slurred. His usual, manipulative, scripture-laced monologue was replaced by a brutish, impatient anger. The rage I had been suppressing for weeks chose that moment to flare up. When he reached for me, I flinched away, a small, involuntary act of rebellion. It was a mistake. The rejection, however slight, sent him into a fury. The rest is a blur of pain and terror, sharper and more violent than anything before. He was no longer a calculating predator, but a wild, unthinking animal. In the midst of it all, there was a sickening, tearing sensation, and a pain so sharp and blinding that it cut through my mental defenses. "Stop!" a voice shrieked. It took me a moment to realize it was Sister Linda. "Gary, for God's sake, stop! Look what you've done!" Through a haze of agony, I saw that her usual placid composure had shattered. Her face was pale, her expression one of genuine panic. The Reverend stumbled back, his drunken rage instantly replaced by a wide-eyed, sober fear as he saw the blood. There was too much of it. This is normal," he stammered, his voice losing all its authority. "It happens with young girls." "Not like this," she hissed, her voice trembling. "This is not normal. She could die. We have to get her to the infirmary." "We can't," he protested, frantically trying to straighten his clothes. "How do we explain this? The questions they'll ask?" He was no longer the powerful Reverend, but a pathetic, frightened little man, terrified of being caught. "We'll say she fell down the main staircase," Sister Linda said, her mind working fast, a chilling testament to how many times she must have had to invent such lies. "We'll say we found her at the bottom. It's the only way. Now help me get her up." They hauled me to my feet, my legs buckling beneath me. The world was spinning, black spots dancing in front of my eyes. I was vaguely aware of being half dragged, half carried through the dark, silent corridors. The pain was a living thing, a fire consuming me from the inside out, and with every step, I could feel my life force draining away. My last conscious thought was a bitter, ironic prayer. So this is how it ends, not in the river after all. I awoke to the scent of lavender and antiseptic, and the unfamiliar sensation of a soft pillow beneath my head. I was in the infirmary, a long, quiet room with a row of neatly made beds, its white walls glowing in the soft morning light. A kindly older nun with gentle hands was dabbing my forehead with a cool, damp cloth. "There now, dear, you're awake," she said softly. "You gave us quite a scare, a terrible fall you had." Before I could speak, Sister Linda appeared at my bedside, her composure fully restored. She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that looked caring to the infirmary nun, but felt like a branding iron to me. "She slipped on the top step of the grand staircase," Linda explained, her voice smooth as silk. "I found her myself. It was a blessing I was passing by." The older nun clucked her tongue in sympathy, but as she examined me, I saw her gaze linger on the bruises and marks that were not consistent with a fall. A shadow of doubt flickered in her eyes, a question she did not dare to ask. She simply nodded. "She'll need to stay here for at least a week," she declared. "She's lost a great deal of blood and needs complete rest." "Of course," Sister Linda agreed readily. "We'll make sure she's well taken care of." Her eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw a clear, cold warning: stick to the story or else. That week in the infirmary was the first time I had felt safe in months. It was a haven of peace and quiet. The Reverend could not reach me here. Sister Linda's visits were brief and always under the watchful eye of the infirmary nun. For the first time, my mind was clear of the constant, imminent threat of assault. And in that clarity, the tiny seed of defiance that had been planted in my mind began to sprout. My window looked out over the eastern side of the grounds, towards the high stone wall that separated St. Margaret's from the woods beyond. For hours each day, I would lie in my bed and watch. I studied the routines of the home from this new vantage point. I noted that this side of the building was usually deserted, especially in the evenings when everyone was in the chapel. I watched the way the shadows grew long in the afternoon, creating pools of darkness that could hide a fleeing girl. The wall was high, impossibly high, but near the corner, a thick, ancient ivy grew, its gnarled vines like a ladder clinging to the stone. The thought of escape, once a terrifying harbinger of death, began to transform into a concrete, tactical problem to be solved. The question was no longer if I could escape, but how. And more importantly, where would I go? I had no money, no knowledge of the surrounding area. Running blindly would only lead me to the fate of the girl in the river. I needed help. On the fourth day, I had an unexpected visitor. Sister Carol came in, carrying a small book of psalms. She smiled at me, but her expression was strained, her gaze full of a pained concern that looked achingly genuine. She sat on the edge of my bed. "How are you feeling, Brenda?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Better, thank you, sister," I replied, my voice a neutral, practiced monotone. I trusted no one. She looked around to ensure we were alone, then leaned closer. "Brenda," she whispered, her voice urgent, "I know what's happening to you. I know you didn't fall." My heart stopped. I stared at her, my mind racing. Was this a trap? Was she working with them, trying to trick me into a confession? The fear and suspicion were so deeply ingrained that I couldn't even recognize a potential lifeline. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, the lie automatic. Please, she said, and I saw tears glistening in her eyes. Don't shut me out. I know about the Reverend. I know about Sister Linda. And I know you're not the first. Hearing her say it aloud, confirming the terrible truth I had only overheard, broke through my defenses. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. I can't talk about it, I choked out. He said it was God's will. He said if I ever told anyone, I would be damned for it. He told the others the same thing, she finished for me, her voice laced with a bitter anger that startled me. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the imposing stone wall. We are all such cowards here, she said, more to herself than to me. We see the evil, we know it's happening, but we are too afraid to speak. Afraid of him, afraid of the matron, afraid of losing the only home we have. It's easier to be blind. She turned back to me, her face set with a new resolve. But you're still fighting. I see it in you. The others, they either broke or they ran blindly. But you are a survivor. I want to run, I confessed in a bare whisper. But I don't know how. I don't know where to go. That was all she needed to hear. In that moment, something shifted in her. A decision was made. I will help you, she said, her voice firm. She came back to the bed and took my hands in hers. They were trembling. I cannot confront him directly. I am not that brave, but I can give you a chance to get away. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, this time not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying hope. How? There's a family in a town about 15 miles from here, she explained, speaking quickly and quietly. A good man named Dennis and his wife, Sharon. He's a carpenter, and she's one of the kindest women I have ever known. They've taken in lost souls before. They won't ask too many questions, and they will protect you. I know them from a long time ago. She reached into the sleeve of her habit and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. This is their address and a short letter from me. It doesn't explain the details, but it says enough for them to understand that you are in grave danger. I took the paper, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hold it. But how do I get there? How do I even get out of this place? In 2 weeks, it is the Feast of All Saints, she said, her eyes bright with the intensity of her planning. It is the most important celebration of the year. The Reverend leads a long, formal evening service. Everyone, every nun, every girl, every staff member will be in the main chapel for at least 2 hours. It's the only time the grounds are completely deserted. She went on to describe the route I had been studying from my window, confirming that the ivy on the east wall was strong enough to climb. It is a terrible risk, Brenda. What if I'm caught? Her face grew grim. If you are caught, you must say you were walking in your sleep. It has happened before with girls under stress. They will give you a penance, and you will return to your routine. She couldn't bring herself to say torture, but we both knew what she meant. Why? I asked, looking into her tear-filled eyes. Why are you risking so much for me? A look of profound sadness passed over her face. Because a long time ago, when I was not much older than you, something terrible happened to me, she said, her voice barely a whisper, and someone who could have helped me chose to look away. I have lived with that cowardice every day of my life. I will not let it happen again. I will not let your soul be destroyed because I was too afraid to act. She didn't say what had happened to her, but in that moment, I understood. She was another ghost of St. Margaret's, one who had simply found a different way to survive. You have 2 weeks, she said, standing to leave. Heal, get your strength back, study the plan, memorize the address, and above all, do not let them see this hope in your eyes. Go back to being the docile, broken girl they think you are. She turned at the door. When you are gone, he will be furious. He will look for someone to blame, but he will have no proof it was me, and perhaps Perhaps it is time one of us paid a price for all the evil that has been allowed to fester in this place. After she left, I lay in the clean, quiet bed, the small folded paper clutched in my hand like a holy relic. It was more than a plan. It was a promise of a life beyond these walls, beyond the reach of the Reverend's hands and Sister Linda's poisonous whispers. When I was released from the infirmary and the nightly ordeals resumed, they had a different meaning. Every unwanted touch, every whispered obscenity, every moment of pain was now fuel for the fire of my resolve. It was no longer just suffering. It was the final price I had to pay for my freedom. For the first time in a long, long time, I had a future to fight for. And as the Feast of All Saints drew closer, my terror began to slowly, miraculously transform into courage. The 2 weeks leading up to the Feast of All Saints were the longest of my life. I lived a strange, dual existence. On the surface, I was the perfect specimen of their monstrous work. Quiet, compliant, my eyes downcast, my spirit seemingly extinguished. I performed my chores with a robotic efficiency. I endured the Reverend's nightly summons with a chilling passivity that seemed to please him and Sister Linda immensely. They saw it as my final, complete submission. They had no idea that beneath the placid, broken exterior, my mind was a hive of activity, a whirlwind of planning and desperate silent prayer. Every night, after the horror of his study and the subsequent emptiness of my cell, I would pull the small, folded piece of paper from its hiding place beneath my thin mattress. In the pale moonlight that filtered through my barred window, I would stare at the address until the letters were burned into my memory. Dennis and Sharon, Carpenter's Lane. It was more than a location. It was a mantra, a prayer, a promise. It was the name of a world outside these walls, a world I was beginning to believe I might actually reach. I began making minuscule preparations. During one meal, I managed to slip a hard roll of bread into my pocket, a transgression that would have earned me a day of solitary fasting had I been caught. I wrapped it in a small piece of cloth I'd torn from the inside of my mattress and hid it with Sister Carol's note. It wasn't much, but it felt like a provision for a great journey. It was an act of hope. Sister Carol and I communicated only through fleeting glances across the dining hall or the chapel. A brief meeting of our eyes, a slight, almost imperceptible nod from her, was enough to confirm that the plan was still in motion. These silent exchanges were my lifeline. They were a reminder that I was not entirely alone in my conspiracy, that one other person in this house of lies knew the truth and was risking everything to help me. The fear I felt for her was almost as great as the fear I felt for myself. The night before the feast, Reverend Gary was in a particularly foul mood. His lesson was shorter than usual, but filled with a cold, menacing edge. As I was leaving, he stopped me at the door. "Tomorrow is a most holy day, Brenda," he said, his voice low and slick. "After the main service, after the congregation has departed, we will have a special celebration of our own, a true test of your newfound devotion." Sister Linda, standing by the fireplace, smiled her chilling, placid smile. His words were a death sentence, and they solidified my resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. There would be no turning back. Tomorrow night I would be free, or I would be dead. There were no other options. The day of the Feast of All Saints arrived, gray and overcast, the sky threatening a storm. The entire home was in a state of reverent excitement. The chapel had been decorated with the last of the autumn flowers from the garden, and the scent of melting beeswax from hundreds of extra candles hung heavy in the air. For everyone else, it was a day of solemn celebration. For me, it was the day of my reckoning. My heart hammered in my chest with a constant, frantic rhythm, a drumbeat counting down the hours. As dusk fell, we were all herded into the main chapel for the service. It was grander than any I had seen before. Wealthy patrons from the nearby town, men and women in their Sunday best, filled the front pews. The matron and the other nuns sat in their designated section, their faces masks of piety. I and the other girls were in the back, as always. Reverend Gary stood at the altar, resplendent in his ceremonial vestments. He looked powerful, untouchable, a true shepherd of his flock. A wave of nausea washed over me as I watched him. This man who was both a pillar of his community and a monster who devoured the young. His eyes swept over the congregation, and for a terrifying second, they met mine. He gave me a small, proprietary smirk, a silent, sickening reminder of the celebration to come. It was the last I ever wanted to see of him. Smile, I thought, with a venom that surprised me. It's the last time you will ever see me. The service began. The choir sang, their voices soaring to the vaulted ceilings. The organ thundered. Reverend Gary's voice, the voice that haunted my nightmares, boomed through the chapel, delivering a long, impassioned sermon on the suffering of the saints and the glory of martyrdom. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I didn't hear the words. I heard only the ticking of a clock that existed only in my mind. I counted the hymns, the prayers, the scripture readings. Sister Carol had said the service would be long, and she was right. It felt endless. Finally, the moment she had described arrived, the Litany of the Saints, a long chanted prayer where the entire congregation was expected to be deeply engrossed, their heads bowed. It was my only chance. My hands were sweating, my breath caught in my throat. I glanced at Sister Carol, who was sitting several rows ahead. She was looking down at her prayer book, but I saw her give another tiny, almost invisible nod. Now. Slowly, silently, I slid from my seat on the hard wooden pew. I moved like a phantom, my worn shoes making no sound on the cold stone floor. No one looked up. They were all lost in their devotions, their eyes closed or fixed on their books. The air was thick with the drone of the chant and the overwhelming scent of incense. I reached the side aisle and began to walk, one careful step at a time, towards the small arched doorway that led to the residential corridors. My heart was a wild thing, threatening to burst from my chest. Every creak of the old building, every cough from the pews, sounded like an alarm bell. When I reached the heavy wooden door, I paused for one last look back. The entire chapel was bathed in the warm, golden glow of hundreds of candles. It looked beautiful, serene, a perfect picture of holiness. But I knew the truth. I knew the darkness that festered just beneath the surface. I slipped through the door and closed it gently behind me, the sound of the chanting instantly muffled, replaced by the profound, echoing silence of the deserted hallway. The contrast was jarring. I was plunged into a world of deep shadows and cold drafts. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and then I began to move, running now, my bare feet slapping softly against the stone. The corridors, which were usually filled with the rustling of habits and the quiet chatter of the girls, were eerily empty. My own breathing sounded deafening in the stillness. I flew past the refectory, the laundry, the classrooms, all the landmarks of my imprisonment. I reached the infirmary without seeing a single soul. Just as she had promised, Sister Carol had left the window at the far end of the room unlatched. I pushed it open, and the cold, damp night air rushed in, smelling of rain and wet earth. It was the smell of freedom. I looked down. The ground was farther away than I had remembered. For a terrifying moment, my courage failed me. What if I fell? What if I broke a leg and was found, a crumpled heap in the courtyard? But then I thought of the Reverend's face, of his promise of a special celebration, and the fear of falling was eclipsed by the terror of staying. I swung my legs over the sill, my hands gripping the cold stone. My thin dress offered no protection against the rough wall as I turned my body and began to feel for the handholds and footholds Sister Carol had described. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, scraped against the stone. The worn leather of my shoes slipped on the damp surface. I held my breath, pressing my body flat against the wall, my cheek scraping against the rough surface. I moved downwards, inch by painful inch, my muscles screaming in protest. When my feet finally touched the wet grass of the courtyard, my knees gave way, and I fell, landing softly on the damp ground. I stayed there for a moment, gasping for breath, my body trembling with adrenaline and relief. I had made it out of the building. But I wasn't free yet. The wall still loomed before me. I scrambled to my feet and ran across the courtyard, sticking to the deep shadows along the edge of the building. I reached the east wall and found the thick, ancient ivy, just as she'd said. Its vines were as thick as my wrist, a tangled, living ladder. I began to climb, my hands searching for purchase among the thick leaves, my feet finding holds in the gnarled vines. It was easier than climbing down the building, the ivy offering a surer grip. Twigs and thorns snagged my dress and scratched my skin, but I barely felt it. I was driven by a singular, desperate purpose. When I reached the top of the wall, I straddled it, pausing to catch my breath and look back one last time. From here, I could see the magnificent stained glass windows of the chapel, blazing with light and color against the dark night. I could still hear the faint, muffled sound of the organ. It was a world of light and music and supposed holiness, and I was leaving it forever for the unknown darkness. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. I swung my other leg over and dropped down into the dense woods that bordered the property. I landed with a thud in a pile of damp leaves, the impact jarring my bones. I was out. I was truly, unbelievably out. But my relief was short-lived. The woods were a terrifying, disorienting maze of blackness. The feeble moonlight was swallowed by the thick canopy of trees, and I was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like I was blind. I stumbled forward, my arms outstretched, trying to follow the faint trail Sister Carol had told me about. Branches whipped at my face, and unseen roots snagged my feet, sending me sprawling more than once. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I kept imagining hands reaching for me from the darkness, the sound of footsteps pounding behind me. After what felt like an eternity of terrified scrambling, I saw a pale, ghostly ribbon through the trees ahead. The road. I broke through the last line of bushes and stumbled onto the dirt track, my lungs burning. It was deserted, stretching into the darkness in both directions. Following Sister Carol's instructions, I turned east and began to walk, forcing myself into a steady, ground-eating pace. About an hour into my journey, the threatened storm finally broke. It started as a light drizzle, but soon became a torrential downpour. The cold rain soaked me to the skin in minutes, plastering my thin dress to my body and my hair to my face. The road turned to slick, thick mud that sucked at my shoes, making every step a struggle. I was cold, miserable, and utterly exhausted. But as the rain washed over me, a strange thing happened. It felt cleansing. It felt as if the icy water was washing away not just the grime of my escape, but the filth of the Reverend's touch, the stain of Sister Linda's whispers, the shame and fear that had been my constant companions for months. I lifted my face to the storm, closed my eyes, and let it pour over me. For the first time since my mother had died, I felt clean. I felt pure. And in that moment, walking alone on a deserted road in the middle of a storm, I began to feel truly free. Fueled by a new, fierce determination, I pushed on. My body ached, my feet were blistered and sore, but my spirit was soaring. Finally, after what must have been nearly 3 hours of walking, I saw them, a small cluster of faint, golden lights twinkling in the distant darkness. the town. The sight gave me a fresh surge of energy. I began to half walk, half run, the muddy road splashing up around me. The town was small, little more than a main street with a few side roads. Most of the houses were dark. The sensible country folk were long asleep. My heart pounded with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown. I found Carpenter's Lane, a narrow, unpaved track that led up a small hill on the edge of the town. And there, at the very end of the lane, was the house. It was just as Sister Carol had described it, a simple, sturdy-looking home with a welcoming light glowing in a downstairs window. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a promise of warmth within. I stopped at the small wooden gate, my courage deserting me once again. I was a complete stranger, a runaway, showing up on a respectable family's doorstep in the middle of the night, looking like something that had been dragged from a river. What if they turned me away? What if they didn't believe my story? What if Sister Carol was wrong about them? The fear of rejection, of being cast back out into the storm and the darkness, was so overwhelming that it rooted me to the spot. I stood there, trembling in the cold rain, staring at the warm, lighted window, caught between the hell I had escaped and a heaven I was not yet sure I would be allowed to enter. I stood before that small wooden gate for what felt like an eternity, the cold rain pasting my thin dress to my shivering body. Inside that house was a light, a fire, the smell of a life I hadn't dared to dream of for months. But fear is a powerful paralytic. What if I had come all this way only to be turned back into the storm? What if my hope was just another cruel trick of the mind? I thought of the Reverend's face, of the river, of the long, dark road behind me. I had not survived all of that only to be defeated by a wooden gate. Taking a shuddering breath that was more a sob than an inhalation, I pushed the gate open. It groaned in the quiet night. I walked up the short stone path and raised a trembling, numb hand to knock on the solid wood of the door. Before my knuckles could make contact, the door swung open. A man stood there, wiping his hands on a cloth. He wasn't old, but his face was kind, framed by a warmth that seemed to emanate from him, pushing back the cold of the night. His expression of mild curiosity shifted instantly to one of deep concern as he took in my wretched state. "Good Lord, child," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "What on earth has happened to you? Get in out of this rain." I tried to speak, to say my name, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The relief, the terror, the bone-deep exhaustion of the last few hours and the last few months all crashed down on me at once. My legs gave out and I crumpled onto his doorstep, a torrent of silent, racking sobs finally breaking free from the prison of my chest. He didn't hesitate. He knelt beside me, his presence solid and reassuring in the stormy darkness. "It's all right. You're safe now," he said gently. "You're safe. Sharon, come quick." A woman appeared behind him, her face a portrait of warmth and compassion. When she saw me, a gasp escaped her lips. "Oh, Dennis, the poor thing. Bring her in to the fire." Between them, they lifted me as if I weighed nothing and half carried me inside, closing the door on the wind and the rain. I was in a kitchen, a room so filled with warmth and the comforting smells of baked bread and wood smoke that it made me dizzy. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting a dancing, golden glow over everything. It was the complete opposite of the cold, sterile emptiness of St. Margaret's. For a moment, I thought I must have died in the woods, and this was heaven. Sharon, the woman, immediately went to work, her movements efficient and kind. She sat me in a chair by the fire, wrapped me in a thick, dry blanket, and began to gently towel my hair. "Dennis, fetch one of Ronald's old nightshirts," she commanded softly. "We need to get this child out of these wet clothes before she catches her death." While Dennis went upstairs, Sharon knelt in front of me and took my cold, trembling hands in her own. Her hands were warm and strong, the hands of a woman who worked hard. She looked directly into my eyes, and her gaze was steady and full of a profound, unquestioning kindness. "You're the girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "The one Sister Carol wrote to us about. You're Brenda." I could only nod, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks. But these were not tears of terror. They were tears of relief, of a gratitude so immense it was painful. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Brenda," she said, her voice soft but firm as steel. "You are safe here. Whatever they did to you in that place, whatever horrors you have seen, they will not touch you again. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." And looking into her honest, compassionate face, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I actually believed it. I was safe. I was free. The first few weeks in the home of Dennis and Sharon were like learning to live again. I slept for almost 2 full days, my exhausted body and soul finally succumbing to the profound safety of a soft bed and a locked door. When I finally emerged, I was introduced properly to their son, Ronald, a quiet young man of 16 with his father's gentle nature. He didn't press me with questions, but treated me with a simple, brotherly kindness that was a balm to my wounded spirit. Healing was a slow, arduous process. At first, every unexpected sound made me jump, and I flinched from any touch, no matter how gentle. Nightmares plagued my sleep, terrible, vivid replays of my time in the Reverend's study, and I would wake up screaming, drenched in a cold sweat. But every time, Sharon would be there, sitting on the edge of my bed, humming a soft lullaby until the trembling stopped, her presence a constant reassuring anchor in the stormy sea of my trauma. They never pushed me to talk. Instead, they gave me space, and they gave me purpose. Sharon taught me the simple, grounding rhythms of a loving home. I learned to knead dough, the repetitive motion a soothing meditation. I learned to tend her small garden, the feeling of rich, clean earth under my fingernails, a welcome contrast to the cold stone of my memories. Dennis, in his workshop behind the house, showed me how to work with wood. He taught me to feel the grain, to respect the material, to have patience. "Wood is honest, Brenda," he told me one afternoon as he showed me how to sand a piece of pine smooth. "It can be scarred and knotted, but with care, you can always bring out its beauty. People are much the same." With Ronald, I learned to laugh again. He showed me the best places to find wild berries in the woods and taught me the names of the constellations in the clear country sky. He treated me not as a victim, but as a person, a friend. Slowly, fragment by fragment, I began to tell them my story. I would speak of the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. And then one evening, sitting by the fire with Sharon while the men were out, I finally told her about Reverend Gary. I couldn't bring myself to speak the clinical, ugly words of what he had done, but I told her of the lessons, of the fear, of the betrayal. She listened without interruption, her face a mask of gathering fury. When I was done, she wrapped her arms around me and held me as I wept. "That is not a man of God," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "That is a devil in a collar, and devils, Brenda, must be cast out." Her righteous anger, her validation of my pain, was a gift beyond measure. For the first time, I felt that what had happened to me was not my shame to bear, but his. Life settled into a gentle, healing routine. Months passed, turning into a year, and then 2. The nightmares became less frequent. The scars on my soul began to fade, covered over by the new, healthy tissue of love and acceptance. I was beginning to feel whole again. But a shadow remained. The knowledge that Reverend Gary and Sister Linda were still there, that other girls were likely suffering as I had suffered, was a weight on my conscience. The catalyst for change arrived in a handsome carriage, bringing a new doctor and his wife to the town. They were from the city, educated, and carried with them an air of authority and a connection to a world beyond our small community. By now, I was 20 years old, no longer a terrified girl, but a young woman forged in fire. With the unwavering support of Dennis, Sharon, and Ronald, I made a decision. I would not let my past lie buried. I would seek justice. I went to the doctor's home, my heart pounding with a familiar fear, but this time it was tempered with resolve. I was welcomed by the doctor and his wife, a kind, intelligent couple who listened with growing horror as I sat in their parlor and told them everything. I left nothing out. The lessons, the complicity, Sister Carol, the girl in the river. I laid the whole ugly story at their feet. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. The doctor's wife was weeping softly. The doctor himself was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "This is not just a sin, Brenda," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is a crime, a series of monstrous crimes, and I will not allow it to stand." He was true to his word. Using his professional status as a cover, he began a discreet investigation. He spoke to families of other girls who had been at St. Margaret's. He uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths, sudden transfers, and whispers of madness that had been silenced by fear and the Reverend's powerful influence for years. Then he orchestrated the most daring part of our plan. Under the pretext of a medical emergency for a distant relative, he managed to get Sister Carol out of St. Margaret's. I will never forget the moment her carriage arrived at the doctor's house. Seeing her again, away from that place of fear, was overwhelming. We embraced, two survivors bound by a shared, terrible secret, and she had brought it with her, a small, secret diary she had kept for years, documenting the names, the dates, and the horrors she had witnessed. It was the proof we needed. We made our plan, a strategy so bold it terrified me, but I knew it was the only way. We would not fight this battle in secret. We would drag the darkness into the light. On a bright Sunday morning, we returned to St. Margaret's. I walked through those iron gates not as a trembling victim, but as an avenger, flanked by my allies, the doctor and his wife, my beloved adopted family Dennis, Sharon, and Ronald, and the bravest woman I knew, Sister Carol, wearing her habit one last time. We entered the chapel in the middle of the service. Reverend Gary was at the altar, his voice booming out a passage of scripture. He faltered when he saw me, his face draining of all color. He saw not just me, but the formidable group with me, and the righteous fury in our eyes. We waited for him to finish his passage. Then, the doctor stood. "Forgive this interruption," he announced, his voice clear and strong, commanding the attention of the entire stunned congregation. "But a matter of grave public concern must be addressed. I am here to formally accuse Reverend Gary of the systematic abuse and torture of the young women entrusted to his care." A collective gasp swept through the chapel. The Reverend sputtered, trying to regain control, calling it blasphemy, lies from a troubled girl. Then I stood up. I found my voice, and it did not tremble. "I am that girl," I said, loud and clear. "My name is Brenda, and for months I was his victim." Standing there in that place of my greatest trauma, with all eyes on me, I told them the truth. I spoke of the study, of Sister Linda's complicity, of the other girls whose lives had been destroyed. I looked directly at Reverend Gary, and I saw not a powerful man of God, but a shrinking, terrified coward. When I was done, Sister Carol stood. "I am Sister Carol," she declared, "and I bear witness to these crimes. Every word Brenda has spoken is true, and I have the proof." She held up the diary. It was then that they broke. Reverend Gary, seeing no escape, collapsed in a pathetic heap before the altar, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, not from God, but from the powerful patrons in the pews. Sister Linda let out a hysterical shriek, confessing her part in it all, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. The illusion of holiness was destroyed, revealing the ugly, rotten core beneath. They were arrested right there in the chapel, dragged away in disgrace. The home was permanently closed, and the other girls inside were finally freed. Reverend Gary was sentenced to a long prison term and died behind bars a few years later. Sister Linda served her time and disappeared into a life of shame and obscurity. As for me, my life began anew. Dennis and Sharon, who had been the parents of my heart, became my parents-in-law when I married their son, Ronald, the kind, gentle boy who had taught me to laugh again. We built a life together, a life filled with light, love, and our own beautiful children. The doctor and his wife remained our dearest friends, and Sister Carol left the order and became a beloved teacher, dedicating her life to protecting vulnerable children. The scars of my past never vanished entirely, a wound that deep always leaves its mark. But I learned that scars are not a sign of weakness. They are a sign of survival. I did not let what that man did to me define me. I transformed my pain into my purpose, dedicating much of my life to advocating for victims of abuse, to being the voice for those who could not speak for themselves. He tried to destroy a young girl, but instead, he forged a warrior. He thought he was taking my life, but he only succeeded in giving me my life's mission. And that, I believe, is the greatest justice of all. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please, share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.